Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is failure versus feedback and what might be available to us if we were to recontextualize failure to be something that is along the lines of feedback, and how that would mitigate our self-punishing behaviors around failure. Hello, Robert. Good morning. It's great to have you here with us. So before we get started with our topic, let's take a minute or two to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs and flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy throughout your body and being. And as we exhale, exhale any tension, any stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, electrifying, energizing, and illuminating all your cells, electrons, and molecules. And as you exhale, exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's just gently press our palms together. Softly, softly rub your fingers against your palms and feel the deliciousness of that sensation, the tickling and the tingling, and bring yourselves present right here, right now. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So Robert says, nice topic. The topic today is failure versus feedback. So Robert says, I believe that every failure is a lesson which we need the feedback from. So I agree with you 100%. And when we judge something as a failure, we are typically placing sort of a moral judgment on that thing, that incident, that occurrence, whatever. And that judgment then can lead to a cascade of other judgments, self-punishing behavior. I shoulda, woulda, coulda, or they shoulda, woulda, coulda, or things should be different in some way, shape, or form. And if instead of looking at failure as a moral judgment upon ourselves or others, what we can perhaps more productively interpret is that we've gotten feedback. So when we've not performed or behaved in the way that we expected or desired to be able to behave, we can look at the circumstances and glean information from those circumstances that if we were to spiral into the notion of failure and being a failure and on and on and on, we might not otherwise see. So when we judge something as a failure, we've lost our objectivity. When we can recognize something as feedback, like we can say, well, this attempt failed, like this way of doing this didn't work. And we can say that that was a failed attempt. But when we migrate into the notion of failure, there are many other factors that influence that to make it a non-objective evaluation of something. So I'm thinking that, for instance, if I have done something or reacted, let's say I was in a situation and got triggered. And so I might go into a spiral of feeling like a failure, or like, feeling disappointed in myself, feeling ashamed, feeling embarrassed, any number of ways to respond to the incident itself that can spiral into a deeper entrenchment into that whole failure dynamic. And what I'm talking about today is how, if we are able, instead of interpreting things as failure or personalizing the failure. Good morning, Grace Isis. I love you. I love that you are saying good morning to core connectors. So yes, we are the core connectors. I love it. I appreciate that so much. It's great to have you here with us. So we're talking about the difference between hello, Rosalind. So wonderful to have you here this morning. Welcome. We're talking about failure versus feedback and what might shift for us if we're able to interpret our circumstances as feedback. There's a neutral perspective, a neutral tenor to the notion of feedback. It is just feedback. And then we get to interpret that feedback. So if I shout at you and you punch me, and not that this happens or that it has happened or anything, I'm just thinking of an extreme example, then I can notice that, that punch was feedback, like that my communication was not well received, for instance. So Josie, welcome. Good to have you here. Josie says, good morning, love, peace, and love be with you, sister. Thank you. So what if, let's say I have a fight with, or an altercation or a disagreement. Good morning, Julie. So good to have you here with us. Let's say I have, somebody says something and I react, and it turns out that like one of my buttons got really triggered and I react all out of proportion. And I could be looking at that afterwards later and beating myself up for reacting that way. And then I go into a further death spiral around what a failure I am in meeting the expectations that I have of myself, and on and on and on. And I could be feeling like I'm unworthy, or, that I'm deficient, or any number of other things that we impose upon ourselves when we get into self beat up mode, right? So what if instead I looked at the situation more objectively to see, oh wow, this is what happened, and I reacted like this. What's going on underneath that? What's available for me to learn? What's an insight that is available for me to gain as a result of looking at this situation without all the reactivity of feeling like I failed, or feeling worse than that, feeling like a failure, identifying, becoming the identity of failure. And I think that there's a tremendous freedom available in this, because what I notice is that self beat up leads to more self beat up. Self judgment leads to more self judgment. And so when we're able to step back and separate the judgment from the situation, we can look at it and say, wow, I reacted like way out of proportion. What's going on? What is it that got triggered? I noticed this happened, and I responded this way. That's feedback. When it's neutralized as feedback, I have less of an aversion to be digging in and looking at it. Also, I can pull myself out of the pattern of self-punishment, punishing myself for responding in a certain way, which just further typically will further embed the behavior to begin with. So instead of the self-punishing, I can be in a place of curiosity and observation. So moving from self-punishing or shame or embarrassment to a place of curiosity, then we have more of an ability to institute the shift or the change that we want to be able to institute or shift, because we can't when we're in a downward spiral of self-judgment and punishment, it's not supporting the ability to make the shift. We often think that if we punish ourselves, it'll stop us from doing the thing that we did in the future. But the thing is, if we don't know what the dynamic is, and if we can't compassionately and curiously investigate that, then it remains a pattern that is entrenched and embedded. So Josie says, self-judgment is the hardest lesson to learn about. I agree. And the thing that I have introduced to my clients that seems to be helpful is to recognize that self-judging part, that part that is beating the heck out of you for your infringements or your missteps, is I encourage people to recognize that part as the bully, and that it's not you, that it's kind of a program. It's a bully that is conditioned, and that we are conditioned to listening to as if it's telling the truth, and it's there to bully us into submission and to keep us from growing and flourishing and expanding, and most of all, keep us from changing. So if we can recognize that self-judging voice as the bully, it gives us a greater latitude to silence it, or at least push it off to the side. We can exile it, and we can say, okay, you're the bully, I really don't need to play with you today. And all these tools together, like recognizing the bully, first of all, and identifying it. When we do recognize and identify the bully, it tends to jump into the shadows because it doesn't want to be identified, typically. But the other thing is that if we can recognize interactions as an interaction, as a dynamic, and look at the mechanics of that dynamic. In other words, look at feedback. So what was the trigger? What was the response? Oh, I can see this is feedback in this experimental cycle. We can consider that we're in an ongoing experiment, right? And I notice when I am sending love and being in a place of love, that I get loving responses. I'm noticing when I disappear or am hiding, that people respond to me in a very different way than when I'm present and available. We see feedback all the time, but we don't necessarily perceive it as feedback, and as a result, we get swept up in the reactivity of the moment. And what's happening there is that it's not enabling us to be present, right? When we're triggered, we're playing out dramas of the past in the present. We're pulling things into the moment that might not be there at all. So for instance, if you say something to me about, I don't know, let's say I have had a really bad experience with melon. Let's say I got really, really sick eating melon once, and you start talking about melon, and I'm getting all upset because what's being triggered is my memory of how sick I got. So maybe I'm feeling nauseous even at your conversation about melon. Well, if I see that, I could just be saying, don't ever talk to me about melon. Or I could also be looking at, wow, that's some really interesting feedback. Something's going on for me around melon. And actually, this isn't as absurd a non sequitur as it might seem. Of what came to mind to me was that my dad could not eat melon after a meal. He could eat melon before a meal, but if he ate melon after a meal, he would get sick. And I asked him what that was about, and it turned out that it had to do with his father, and his father would have melon for dessert, and maybe he would force it on my dad. But anyway, it was a psychological trigger. And I don't think my dad ever really allowed himself to look at the association that he was having to be able to untangle it. But this is the kind of automatic reaction. We just say, oh, I hate melon, or I don't eat melon, or I won't eat melon for dessert, instead of seeing the feedback and saying, oh, with curiosity, what is it that's going on there? And so I think that if welcome, Pat. Good afternoon to you. So glad to have you here with us. We're talking about failure versus feedback. So by converting our notion of failure to a recognition instead of that we're receiving feedback, we can free ourselves from a lot of the guilt and the shame and the self-punishing that is attendant with this notion of failure. Because that's another thing I think culturally that we are inclined toward, is that if I failed at something, at this particular, if I failed to get the result that was the intended result, we personalize that and then identify with, I not only did I fail, but I am a failure. And if instead we were able to say, well, this attempt at that failed, it didn't achieve the intended objective, that is a very different thing than translating that into a personal sense of failure, which goes into being not good enough, or to being guilty or shameful, etc. And the thing is that when we view these things as feedback rather than failure, like personal failure, then I believe that we're buoying the capacity for greater resilience, because we're not making something mean that I'm a failure, I'm no good, I can't, I shouldn't, and on from there. What we can say, we can redouble our efforts. We can say, okay, that's feedback. So I noticed that this and this and this didn't collectively work together to get the result that I'm aiming for. I can take a new approach. Let's try another way to see if, see what the feedback is, and to see if that is more effective in achieving the objective. So I'm wondering if you have situations in your life where you can look at, that's another thing actually that happens with this notion of I'm a failure or I failed, is a sense of disappointment in oneself. You know, disappointment, despair, depression. There's this whole downward spiral that is provoked by this notion of failure. And as people collectively, the folks that are here, I'm making an assumption that you are, as well as I am, committed to growth and evolution, individually and otherwise, that we want to be able to utilize tools that are the most effective in serving that end. And failure is kind of like a hard stop. And not only is it a hard stop in progress, but it's kind of a regressive thing, because it can lead into all these self-defeating patterns of beat up and shame and blame and disappointment and inadequacy, et cetera, et cetera. So although we may have been making progress, when we hit that place of deciding that we failed, we end up backsliding. Whereas if we can recognize this as feedback, we might have a temporary setback, but then we can move beyond it, and we get to put the bully in its proper place, you know, which is in where its voice is not really heard. So, or where its voice is understood to be the bully that we don't have to choose to play with. And I'm just thinking of, I'm thinking particularly of a conversation that I had yesterday, and that's what prompted this conversation today. And that was about falling into a pattern of self beat up, which then became an exponential pattern of experience and spiraled into a multiple day experience of self-punishing. You know, so what is one of the things that we can look at is, well, okay, I go into the self-punishing mode. What's behind it? What's up with that? And often what's behind it is if I believe that I deserve to be punished, what is the underlying belief that is manifesting in that way? So something related to being bad or wrong, or it was interesting in this conversation because the person said, I would never beat up a kid emotionally or otherwise. I would never beat up a kid for having a meltdown, you know, but as an adult, we believe we should never, there's that operative word, we should never find ourselves in a place of reactivity. We should never have a meltdown. We have very high and probably unreasonable expectations of ourselves. You know, we get to be more forgiving. The interesting thing is, and you might experience this as you move from the self-blame to or self-punishing or failure mode to the feedback mode, from the outside, it might look kind of crazy. It might look like you're all over the place emotionally, because in one moment you're reacting, and then in another moment you have an awareness, a flash of awareness to say, oh, I get to choose. Maybe I can look at this as feedback, and that neutralizes the emotion. So there are these whipsaw swings from one end of the emotional spectrum to the other. And it could look kind of crazy, and it could feel kind of crazy too, because that's, you're in a process of change and repatterning. And that process of change and repatterning can be kind of messy. It can be kind of erratic. It can, as we're flashing in and out of awareness uh, from the outside, even, and from the inside, it can feel kind of extreme, right? It's like, well, what's true? What's real? What's not real? It's like, where do I have choice? Who am I? What am I? Kind of thing. And that's all. It's all okay. If you can make space for that to be okay, then you're clearing the resistance to the disorientation that can occur as we evolve and grow. So I guess we get to allow ourselves to welcome the disorientation, the unfamiliarity of moving into new spaces of awareness. And maybe that too is part of building our building our resilience, to be releasing the resistance, perhaps can help to build our resilience. So maybe I should write that down as a topic for tomorrow: resistance and resilience. Yeah, because we do have capacities for change and adaptation and learning and growth that we don't even imagine. And if we can remove the barriers to those imaginings, who knows where we could go. So and the resilience that is needed to adapt to all these changes is something that we can cultivate. And I think one of the ways to cultivate that is by neutralizing some of our judgments. And failure certainly is a very harsh and painful judgment to be imposing on ourselves and others. And when we're able to instead view things as feedback, to go back to what Robert said in the beginning, is we have the greater ability to find the lesson in something. We don't want to learn that we're a failure, because that's non-productive. What we want to learn is, what the feedback is, and then from there we can perhaps extrapolate a new and perhaps more effective behavior. So Pat says, my grandson Tom has so much resilience. Perhaps we can learn from the children. Oh, Pat, I so believe we can. I think that children have so much to teach us, for sure. And the truth is that none of us, had we not had resilience, none of us would have learned to walk, right? Good morning, Bernadette. You made it just in under the wire. It's so good to have you here this morning. Yeah, so feedback instead of failure. Like we can look at, we didn't achieve the desired objective, or we can look at, we had expectations that we weren't aware of. We can look more objectively when we recognize circumstances as feedback rather than failure. So, we often go into the I screwed up kind of mentality, and then what's wrong with me, and I should have known better, and I'm ashamed, and like that whole spiral. Look at what feedback. Feedback is, this didn't work, and what might work better next time. So feedback and curiosity. In any case, that's it for today. As always, I just love being here with you. I so appreciate you and your feedback and your engagement. And it's just so enriching to me to be able to have this time with you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection. I go live each weekday morning here on Enlightened World Network's Facebook page. Please, please check out the other awesome programming on Enlightened World Network, on the EWN One with the Earth, as well as Enlightened World Living. And until next time, let's be kinder to ourselves and suspend judgment, and instead look at feedback. So much love.